Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Secrets channel. Tonight we walk into a winter that does not care about comfort, forecasts, or central heating. You are standing somewhere in the Middle Ages, your breath already fogging the air, the ground stiff beneath your boots. The year is sliding toward its coldest weeks, and the sky feels lower, heavier, like it might press down on you if you stand still too long. You can smell damp wood, old smoke, and wool that has been worn too many times to count. This is not the kind of cold that feels sharp and exciting. This is the slow, creeping cold that settles into your bones and politely refuses to leave. And yes, you probably will not survive this without help. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, drop a comment telling everyone where you are listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. You do not experience medieval winter as a dramatic blizzard every day. Most of the danger comes quietly. It comes from weeks of weak sunlight, from damp clothes that never quite dry, from the simple fact that your body burns calories faster than you can replace them. A well-known historical reality is that medieval winters were deadlier than wars in many regions, especially during the so-called Little Ice Age, when average temperatures dropped across Europe. Cold killed through exhaustion, infection, and hunger long before frostbite ever became dramatic enough to notice. As you walk through a village at dusk, you hear very little. Snow absorbs sound, and so does fear. Doors are shut early. Smoke seeps from cracks rather than chimneys, because every opening leaks heat. You notice people moving with intention. Nothing is rushed, but nothing is wasted either. Winter thinking is different. Every step, every breath, every log placed on the fire carries weight. Here is something rarely mentioned. Medieval people did not think of winter as a season. They thought of it as an opponent. Chroniclers described winter as something that arrived, lingered, and sometimes had to be endured rather than lived through. One quirky detail survives in household accounts. Some families measured winter not by dates, but by how long their stored candles lasted. When the last candle burned down, anxiety set in, even if snow still covered the fields. You step closer to a house. It is smaller than you expect, squat and huddled, like it knows it should not challenge the cold. The walls are thick, packed with stone, earth, or timber and clay. This is not architecture for beauty. This is architecture for survival. Historians still argue whether these homes were designed with thermal knowledge in mind, or whether people simply learned over generations what shapes happened to work. Either way, the result is the same. The house seems to breathe slowly, holding on to warmth the way a clenched fist holds a coin. Inside, the light is dim and yellow. The fire is low, not roaring. A roaring fire eats fuel too fast. A steady one lasts. You feel the temperature difference immediately. Not warm exactly, but less hostile. Medieval warmth was relative. If your fingers could move and your teeth were not chattering, you were doing well. You notice how close everything is. Furniture hugs the hearth. Beds are tucked into corners. There is a reason for this. Heat does not travel far in winter houses, and distance from the fire can mean the difference between sleep and misery. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that medieval people spent much more time indoors during winter than we imagine. Not out of laziness, but because movement itself burned precious energy. Your body responds to the cold before your mind does. Shoulders tense. Breathing becomes shallow. The medieval world understood this without biology textbooks. They knew cold made you slow, dull, and careless. That is why winter survival was as much mental as physical. Songs were sung not just for joy, but to keep spirits from sinking too low. There are records of villagers fined for skipping communal winter gatherings because isolation was seen as dangerous. And then there is the forgotten preparation that begins long before the first snow. You can feel it now in the atmosphere. The quiet confidence of people who have been here before. They stored food not just for hunger, but for heat. Digesting food warms the body, a fact medieval physicians knew well. Spices were prized not only for taste, but because they were believed to stoke internal fire. Pepper, ginger, and cloves show up repeatedly in winter advice texts. Here is a strange tidbit that always makes modern listeners smile. Some medieval manuals advised rubbing the chest with warm animal fat before going outside, believing it sealed heat inside the body. Whether it worked or not is questionable, but the smell alone probably kept people moving fast. You realize quickly that winter is not fought alone. Survival is collective. One person failing weakens everyone. If a neighbor runs out of fuel, they might borrow yours, and next week you might need theirs. This is why hoarding was frowned upon, even punished. Cold was a shared enemy. As night deepens, you hear the wind testing the walls. It finds every gap, every weakness. You pull your cloak tighter, even indoors. That instinct is ancient. Medieval people slept clothed, often fully dressed, because undressing wasted warmth. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether people felt colder then than we do now, or whether constant exposure made them more tolerant. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, like the fire itself. Never extreme, always measured. This first night of winter thinking settles over you slowly. You begin to understand that survival here is not about heroic endurance. It is about small, repeated choices. Where you stand, when you eat, who you sit beside. The method you will soon discover is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost boring. And that is exactly why it worked. Outside, snow continues to fall, soft and relentless. Inside, you adjust your position closer to the hearth, listening to the wood pop and sigh. The cold has arrived, but so has something else. Knowledge, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. You are only just beginning to feel it. The fear settles in deeper once the sun goes down early enough that it feels like a trick. You look up from your work and it is already dusk, the light thinning, the world slipping into shadow long before you feel ready. This is when medieval winter truly begins, not with snow, but with darkness. You feel it pressing at the edges of your awareness, stretching the nights until they seem endless. Candles become precious. Oil lamps are trimmed carefully. Every flame is watched like a living thing that might die if neglected. People in the Middle Ages feared the long night more than the cold itself. Cold could be layered against. Darkness was harder. A widely accepted historical fact is that winter evenings reshaped daily schedules entirely. Work compressed into daylight hours, while nights were reserved for rest, repair, and quiet tasks that required more patience than light. You can almost feel your body adjusting, learning to slow down whether you like it or not. You sit near the hearth and listen. The sounds are different at night. Wood creaks as temperatures drop. Roof beams shift slightly, reminding you that the house is alive in its own way. Outside, animals settle. Inside, people speak more softly, as if loud voices might attract something unwelcome from the dark. Wolves were not just a story in many regions. They were a real winter threat, drawn closer to villages when food grew scarce. Their howls carried farther in cold air, and hearing one after sunset could tighten your chest instantly. Here is a detail that feels almost intimate. Medieval people often timed their prayers to night sounds. Bells, when they rang, helped orient people in the darkness. In villages without bells, families marked time by listening for distant roosters or dogs. A quirky fringe belief held that losing track of time at night made the cold feel worse, as if confusion itself invited illness. Whether that was true or not, structure mattered. You notice how everyone stays closer together after dark, not just emotionally, but physically. Benches are pulled in, sleeping spaces overlap, privacy shrinks. This was not accidental. Shared presence fought fear. Modern psychology would call it comfort. Medieval thinking called it common sense. There is still debate among scholars about how much winter mortality was influenced by loneliness rather than temperature alone. Some argue isolation weakened immune responses. Others say it simply led to poorer decision-making. Either way, being alone at night in winter was never ideal. The darkness also changed how stories were told. Winter tales were slower, longer, and more repetitive. You hear the same legends retold, night after night, because familiarity was soothing. Sudden surprises were avoided. Even jokes softened. Laughter still existed, but it was gentler, less sharp. You sense that emotional steadiness was another survival tool, even if no one named it that way. Food after sunset was strategic. A small meal before bed was common, not for indulgence, but to keep internal heat going through the night. This practice shows up in household records across medieval Europe. Physicians of the time advised warm, thick foods in the evening, avoiding anything cold or watery. Broths, porridges, and bread soaked in ale appear again and again. Digestive warmth mattered when the fire burned low. There is a strange habit you might notice. People often kept embers alive through the night, rather than letting the fire die completely. Someone would wake briefly to stir the hearth, half asleep, careful not to fully rekindle it. This reduced fuel use and kept the room from plunging into freezing temperatures by morning. It also created a rhythm of broken sleep that modern people might find exhausting. Medieval sleepers accepted it as normal. Sleep itself was different in winter. You do not fall unconscious for 8 hours straight. You drift, wake, listen, adjust, then drift again. The darkness stretches time, making each waking moment feel longer. Some historians suggest this segmented sleep helped people monitor fires and animals. Others think it simply emerged naturally when nights grew longer than days. Fear lurks quietly beneath all of this. Fear of sickness, fear of running out of food, fear that spring will not come soon enough. Medieval people understood that winter could undo a household slowly. One illness, one injury, one mistake, and recovery became difficult. This awareness sharpened winter behavior. Risk-taking dropped, travel slowed. Even arguments were sometimes postponed until warmer months, a fact mentioned in several legal records. You feel your own awareness narrowing, turning inward. The outside world shrinks to what the firelight reveals. Shadows dance on the walls, stretching objects into unfamiliar shapes. You might imagine things moving that are not. Medieval texts mention night fears openly, including the belief that cold made the mind more vulnerable to bad thoughts. Remedies included prayer, storytelling, and staying physically close to others. A curious fringe practice appears in some regions. People placed iron objects near sleeping areas, believing iron warded off both spirits and cold. While the supernatural aspect is easy to dismiss, iron does retain heat longer than wood, so the practice may have offered mild warmth. Historians still argue whether this was coincidence or quiet observation disguised as belief. As the night deepens, you feel the house settle fully. The fire dims to a glow, breathing slows around you. The fear does not disappear, but it becomes manageable, contained. Winter nights are not conquered, they are endured, one after another, with patience rather than bravery. You pull your cloak tighter and listen to the soft rhythm of shared sleep. The long night stretches ahead, but you are not facing it alone, and that, more than anything, is how medieval people learned to survive the dark. You step fully inside the house now, letting the door close behind you with a thick wooden thud that feels final. The outside cold does not vanish, but it dulls, like a distant ache instead of a sharp pain. This space was never meant to impress anyone. It was meant to endure. You can feel that immediately. The air smells of smoke soaked into beams over decades, of damp earth underfoot, of wool and skin and old meals that have long since cooled. The house feels less like a structure and more like a sheltering animal, hunkered down against the season. Medieval homes were designed less by blueprints and more by memory. People built the way their parents had built, and their parents before them. Over time, shapes that failed disappeared. Shapes that worked survived. Thick walls are the first thing you notice. Stone, packed clay, timber filled with straw, whatever materials were available locally, all layered to slow the movement of cold air. Written descriptions from the period make it clear that thin walls were associated with poverty or bad luck. A solid wall meant survival. The ceilings are low, lower than you expect. You instinctively duck. This is not accidental. Warm air rises, and a low ceiling traps it closer to where people actually sit and sleep. There is no wasted space here. Even the corners feel purposeful. You notice fewer windows than a modern house would have, and those that exist are small, often shuttered, sometimes covered with oiled cloth instead of glass. Light is sacrificed willingly if it means keeping warmth inside. You run your hand along the wall and feel its uneven texture. Nothing here is smooth. Smoothness would mean gaps, drafts, weakness. Builders pressed materials together tightly, sometimes sealing cracks with moss, rags, or even dung mixed with clay. That last detail sounds unpleasant, but it worked. A lesser-known household practice involved resealing walls every autumn, almost like giving the house a winter coat. Families treated this task seriously, knowing missed gaps could invite sickness. The hearth dominates the room, not because it is large, but because everything orbits it. It is placed centrally when possible, allowing heat to spread evenly. Archaeological remains show that homes with off-center hearths were often colder and abandoned sooner. Firewood stacks sit nearby, carefully measured. Burning too much is as dangerous as burning too little. You get the sense that everyone here knows exactly how long each bundle is meant to last. What surprises you is how quiet the house is, even with people inside. Thick walls muffle sound, both from outside and within. This quiet had value. Loud spaces lose heat faster through vibration and movement. Whether medieval builders understood this scientifically is unclear, but experience taught them restraint. Some modern researchers suggest that the calm atmosphere of winter homes helped reduce stress, which in turn supported health. Others believe the quiet was simply a side effect of close quarters and fatigue. The truth likely blends both. You notice that furniture is sparse and heavy, benches are solid, tables thick, chests large and dense. Light furniture shifts, creaks, lets drafts through. Heavy objects anchor a room, both physically and psychologically. Chests often serve double duty, storing clothing while also blocking cold from creeping along the floor. People positioned them deliberately, almost like movable walls. Sleeping areas are not separate rooms in many houses. Beds are curtained, tucked into alcoves, or placed near the hearth. Fabric hangings create microclimates, trapping body heat. One small but fascinating detail from household inventories shows that bed curtains were often valued more highly than mattresses. Fabric mattered more than softness. Enclosure mattered more than comfort. The floor beneath your feet is cold, but covered. Rushes, straw, or woven mats layer the ground, absorbing moisture and insulating toes. These coverings were replaced regularly in winter, more often than in summer. Some sources mention herbs mixed into floor layers, not just for scent, but because certain plants were believed to resist dampness. Whether that belief was accurate remains uncertain, but the practice was widespread. You begin to understand that the house does not fight winter aggressively. It slows it down. Cold still enters, but at a pace the body can manage. That balance is everything. Too much heat dries air and wastes fuel. Too little weakens people over time. Medieval homes aimed for something in between, a steady, dull warmth that never quite feels cozy, but never feels deadly either. There is an odd detail that often escapes notice. Many houses included a small, unheated space near the entrance, a kind of buffer zone. Stepping inside did not immediately expose the living area to outside air. This feature appears again and again in surviving structures. It is a simple idea, but effective. Modern homes still use it, often without realizing how old the concept is. As you sit, you notice how your breathing changes. It slows. The house seems to encourage stillness. Movement stirs air. Air carries heat away. Winter living favored calm. This is why winter crafts like spinning, mending, and carving became common. They required minimal movement but kept hands busy and minds occupied. There is disagreement among historians about how intentional all of this was. Some argue medieval people lacked theoretical understanding and relied purely on tradition. Others point out repeated patterns across regions that suggest conscious adaptation. You feel, sitting here, that intention and tradition blur. Knowledge does not need to be written down to be real. The house creaks softly as night deepens, not from weakness, but from adjustment. Wood contracts, stone settles. You are inside a structure that has learned to survive winter the same way its occupants have, slowly, quietly, by refusing to give the cold any unnecessary opportunities. You lean back against the wall, feeling its stored chill and faint warmth all at once. The house holds you, imperfectly, but faithfully, and as the fire glows low, you begin to sense that the true method of winter survival is not a single trick, but an environment shaped to make endurance possible, night after night. You reach for another layer without thinking. It is instinctive now, like blinking. Medieval winter clothing was not about fashion, even when it looked decorative. It was about managing heat, minute by minute, hour by hour. You feel the weight of fabric settle on your shoulders, heavier than modern clothes, denser, less forgiving. Every garment serves a purpose, and very little is worn directly against bare skin. The first layer is linen. That surprises many people. Linen feels cool at first touch, but it absorbs moisture quickly. Sweat is dangerous in winter. Dampness steals heat faster than wind. Linen pulls moisture away from the body, keeping skin drier. Period advice texts mention changing linen frequently in winter when possible, especially after physical work, not because people feared dirt, but because they feared chill. Over that comes wool. the true hero of medieval survival. Wool insulates even when wet, traps air efficiently, and lasts for years. Sheep were winter insurance on 4 legs. You wrap yourself in a wool tunic, then another. Sleeves are snug at the wrist to stop drafts. Necklines sit high. Buttons and ties close gaps carefully. Clothing silhouettes were shaped by climate as much as culture. A common belief at the time held that cold entered the body through openings: wrists, neck, ankles, head. You notice how thoroughly these areas are covered. Hats are worn indoors. Hoods stay up near the fire. This was not seen as strange. Exposed skin meant wasted warmth. One small but telling detail from medieval art shows people sleeping in hats, a practice confirmed by household records listing nightcaps alongside bedding. You add a belt around your waist. This does more than hold tools. It gathers fabric, reducing airflow inside clothing. Layers work best when they stay close. Loose garments flap and vent heat away. Tight ones restrict movement and circulation. Medieval tailoring balanced these concerns surprisingly well, especially in colder regions. Footwear is heavy and lined. Socks are wool, sometimes doubled. Shoes are stuffed with straw or scraps of fabric for extra insulation. This stuffing is changed often, not for comfort, but because compressed material loses its insulating ability. Some people carried spare stuffing in winter, replacing it during long days. It is a small habit, but one that mattered. There is a curious winter practice that survives in fragments of advice literature. People were warned not to overdress during physical labor, even in cold weather. Sweating was seen as dangerous, leaving the body vulnerable once activity stopped. Instead, workers adjusted layers frequently, removing and adding garments throughout the day. This constant attention to clothing required awareness and discipline. Colors also played a role. Darker fabrics absorbed more sunlight, however weak winter sun might be. This effect is subtle, but in a world where every advantage counted, it mattered. Some inventories show winter garments dyed darker than summer ones, even within the same household. You notice repairs everywhere: patches, reinforcements, added linings. Winter clothing was not replaced casually. It was maintained obsessively. A small tear could let in cold air, turning into illness. Needles and thread were winter survival tools, as important as firewood. Mending often happened by the hearth, fingers working steadily while heat stayed close. There is disagreement among modern experts about how warm these layers actually made people. Some argue medieval clothing was insufficient by modern standards. Others point out that constant movement and adaptation made it effective. Standing still in medieval winter clothing is uncomfortable. Living in it, adjusting constantly, tells a different story. A lesser-known detail appears in travel accounts. People sometimes wore multiple belts, not for decoration, but to support heavy layers and reduce strain on the body. Clothing weight added fatigue over time. Belts redistributed it, making long winter days more manageable. You also sense the social side of winter clothing. People borrowed garments, shared cloaks, handed down layers from older to younger family members. Clothing circulated like food. Ownership was flexible when survival was at stake. Hoarding warmth was frowned upon, especially during harsh seasons. As evening approaches, you add one last layer, thicker, softer, meant for stillness rather than movement. This is indoor clothing, reserved for sitting, sleeping, enduring the long hours of dark. You feel yourself slow as it settles around you. Movement becomes deliberate. Breathing deepens. The layers do not eliminate the cold. They negotiate with it. They create a buffer, a small zone where your body can function without panic. You understand now that winter survival was not about bravado or toughness. It was about attentiveness. Feeling when you were too warm, feeling when you were too cold, responding before either became dangerous. You adjust your sleeves, tuck fabric closer to your neck, and sit back near the hearth. Outside, the cold waits patiently. Inside, you are wrapped in generations of learned behavior, stitched together with wool, linen, and quiet care. You begin to feel hunger differently in winter. It is not sharp or urgent at first. It is slow, persistent, like the cold itself. Medieval people understood this well. Eating was not just about staying alive. It was about staying warm. Food was fuel in the most literal sense. You feel it when a warm meal settles in your stomach, spreading a dull heat outward, loosening fingers and shoulders. Winter diets shifted noticeably. Fresh vegetables disappeared or became rare. What remained was dense, filling, and repeatable. Grain porridge, thick breads, beans, and root vegetables formed the backbone of most meals. Meat appeared more often than in summer, especially salted or smoked varieties, because slaughtering animals before winter reduced the burden of feeding them. Household records confirm a spike in preserved meat consumption during cold months. Fat mattered. Butter, lard, and dripping were prized winter foods. They carried energy efficiently and cooked quickly. A pot of beans with added fat could sustain someone through hours of cold work. Physicians of the time wrote that fat foods strengthened internal warmth. While their explanations leaned on humoral theory, the practical effect was real. Calories kept bodies moving. You notice that meals are warm when possible. Cold food was avoided in winter, even if it meant reheating leftovers repeatedly. Bread was dipped in broth or ale. Ale itself was often served warmed. This practice shows up in tavern regulations and monastic rules alike. Warm liquids were believed to protect the chest and throat, areas thought especially vulnerable to cold. Here is a small but telling habit. People ate slowly in winter. Rushing food meant poor digestion, which was associated with chills and weakness. Meals became quieter, more deliberate. Even communal feasts felt calmer. Winter was not the season for excess energy. Storage shaped everything. Cellars, pits, and barrels determined what you ate and when. Root vegetables were kept buried in earth, insulated by straw. Grain was dried thoroughly before storage to prevent spoilage. A single damp barrel could ruin months of food. Families checked stores obsessively, sometimes daily, during harsh winters. There is a curious winter food that appears in several regions. Pottage, a thick stew, varied endlessly depending on what was available. It was forgiving, adaptable, and warming. Almost anything could be added. Bones simmered for hours, extracted every possible nutrient. This slow cooking also warmed the house slightly, a side benefit not lost on anyone. Some people believed certain foods actively repelled cold. Onions, garlic, and leeks were popular for this reason. Their strong flavors were associated with strength and vitality. Whether they truly warmed the body is debatable, but they did encourage eating when appetite flagged. Winter illness often began with loss of hunger. You sense how closely food and morale are linked. A good meal lifts spirits. A thin one dampens them. Medieval leaders understood this. Lords were expected to provide extra rations during severe winters. Failing to do so risked unrest. Food was stability. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how nutritionally adequate medieval winter diets were. Some argue deficiencies were common. Others note that diets, while repetitive, often met basic needs surprisingly well. The truth varied by region and class, but survival depended less on variety than consistency. A lesser-known practice involved timing meals to the coldest parts of the day. Eating before dawn work and again before sleep helped maintain warmth during vulnerable hours. Skipping evening meals was discouraged. Even monasteries adjusted fasting rules slightly in winter, acknowledging the strain of cold on the body. You also notice how nothing is wasted. Broths are reused. Bread scraps thicken stews. Fat is saved, rendered, reused. Winter teaches efficiency. Waste feels dangerous when resupply is months away. As you finish your meal, you feel heavier, slower, but steadier. This is the point. Winter food is not meant to energize bursts of activity. It is meant to sustain. You wipe your hands, tuck leftovers away carefully, and settle closer to the fire. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. Inside, warmth comes not from abundance, but from careful planning and shared meals. Eating becomes another quiet method of survival, practiced daily, barely noticed, but absolutely essential. You might expect fire to be the obvious answer to winter cold, but medieval people treated flame with caution. Fire was powerful, useful, and dangerous. It could warm you, cook your food, and light the dark, but it could also burn down everything you depended on. So instead of roaring blazes, you find something quieter, controlled heat without spectacle. The hearth sits low, often closer to the ground than you would expect. This keeps sparks contained and warmth concentrated where people actually live. Fires are fed slowly, log by log, not piled high. Wood is stacked by size, not randomly. Small pieces start the heat, larger ones maintain it. This careful pacing shows up again and again in household instructions from the period. Charcoal appears more often than open flame in winter. It burns longer and steadier, producing consistent warmth without large flames. Charcoal braziers could be moved closer to where people sat, turning heat into something portable. There are records of households owning multiple small braziers, repositioned throughout the day like pieces on a board. A detail that often surprises modern listeners is how much medieval people relied on residual heat. Stones heated near the fire were placed under benches or near beds. Clay tiles were warmed and wrapped in cloth. Even metal tools were sometimes heated and set near sleeping areas. These objects released warmth slowly over hours. It was not dramatic, but it worked. One strange but persistent winter habit involved ash. Ash was not waste, it was insulation. Warm ashes were banked over embers to keep them alive overnight. Ash pits stored heat quietly, allowing fires to be revived in the morning with minimal fuel. This practice required skill. Too much ash smothered the fire. Too little let it die. Knowing the balance mattered. You notice how smoke behaves differently in winter houses. Chimneys existed, but many were inefficient. Smoke often lingered, seeping out through roof gaps. While unpleasant, it served a purpose. Smoke helped dry the interior, discouraging dampness that made cold more dangerous. It also preserved wood and deterred pests. Winter houses smelled of smoke because smoke helped them survive. There is disagreement among modern researchers about how healthy this environment was. Smoke exposure clearly had drawbacks, yet some argue that the antimicrobial properties of smoke reduced certain infections. The evidence is mixed, and the question remains open, but medieval people accepted smoke as part of warmth. Candles and oil lamps added more than light. Their small flames contributed heat, especially in enclosed spaces. A cluster of candles could raise the temperature slightly in a curtained bed or small room. This is mentioned in monastery rules that allowed extra candles during extreme cold. Fuel itself was carefully chosen. Hardwoods burned longer, softwoods ignited quickly. Peat was common in some regions, producing steady heat with little flame. Dung, dried and shaped, was used where wood was scarce. This detail often draws surprise, but dried dung burned slowly and evenly. Winter survival left little room for disgust. You feel how all of this adds up. Heat comes from many small sources, rather than one overwhelming fire. The body adapts to a background warmth, not a blast. This reduces shock when moving away from the hearth. Sudden temperature changes were believed to invite illness, and people actively avoided them. As night approaches, fires are lowered, not extinguished. Embers glow softly. The room darkens. You pull closer to others. Heat becomes communal again, shared through proximity rather than flame. You realize now that medieval warmth was layered just like clothing. Fire, embers, heated objects, bodies, and walls all worked together. Remove one, and the system weakened. Add too much of one, and danger followed. You sit quietly, watching the hearth breathe. Not blazing, not dead, just enough. In a world where fuel is finite and winter is long, this quiet balance is another forgotten skill. Heat without flame, survival without excess. You feel it most clearly when you stop moving. The moment work ends and stillness begins. The cold creeps back in, testing every layer you wear. This is when medieval people turned to something older than buildings or fire. Each other, heat shared between bodies mattered more than any single blanket. You sit closer to those around you, close enough to feel subtle warmth through wool and linen. This is not intimacy in the romantic sense. It is practical, almost automatic. Benches were narrow for a reason. Beds were shared not just by couples, but by children, siblings, and sometimes unrelated adults. Solitude was a luxury winter could not afford. Written accounts from the period make it clear that sleeping alone in winter was uncommon, especially among the poor. Even in wealthier households, servants often slept together in groups near the warmest parts of the house. Body heat accumulated slowly but steadily. One person added little. Several together changed everything. You lie down and feel the difference immediately. Breath warms the air beneath blankets. Movements create small pockets of heat that linger. The cold does not disappear, but it retreats slightly, like a cautious animal. This is why beds were wide and mattresses thick with straw or feathers. Insulation worked best when compressed by weight and warmed by presence. There is a lesser-known detail that often surprises modern listeners. People sometimes slept head to toe, alternating directions to maximize warmth distribution. This practice appears in multiple regions and periods. It reduced cold spots and balanced body heat more evenly. Comfort took precedence over dignity. You also notice how still everyone becomes. Fidgeting lets warmth escape. Winter sleep favors calm. Even breathing slows, deep and steady. Nighttime talking fades quickly. Energy is conserved unconsciously. Children were placed between adults whenever possible. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. This was understood instinctively. Household advice texts mention protecting children from night cold as a priority, even above elders. Survival depended on the next generation making it through winter. There is ongoing discussion among historians about whether these sleeping arrangements spread illness more easily. Some argue close quarters increased transmission. Others note that warmth and rest strengthened resistance. Evidence points both ways, and context mattered. What is clear is that medieval people accepted the trade-off. Cold was the more immediate threat. You feel how shared heat also eases fear. Darkness feels less heavy when someone breathes beside you. Winter nights stretched long, and anxiety thrived in silence. Proximity calmed the mind as much as the body. This psychological warmth mattered more than any calculation. A curious custom appears in some regions. Travelers were welcome to share sleeping space during winter nights, even among strangers. Hospitality was not just kindness, it was practical. Another body meant more warmth for everyone. Turning someone away in winter could invite disaster, both moral and physical. You adjust slightly, careful not to disturb the balance. Blankets are arranged to cover gaps, edges are tucked. Medieval bedding was designed to be sealed, almost like clothing. Drafts were the enemy. As sleep deepens, you sense how this method required trust. Trust that others would stay still. Trust that no one would steal covers. Trust that shared space was safe. Winter encouraged cooperation, not through ideals, but necessity. The house creaks softly. Outside, the cold presses on. Inside, warmth circulates quietly between bodies. No fire could replace this. No wall could replicate it. This simple, human method carried countless people through nights that might otherwise have been fatal. You drift, held not just by blankets, but by shared presence. The cold waits patiently beyond the walls, but for now, it cannot quite reach you. Sleep comes differently now. It does not drop over you all at once. It seeps in slowly, folding itself around the cold, the darkness, the quiet breathing of others nearby. Medieval winter sleep is not a single long fall into unconsciousness. It is a series of gentle descents and shallow returns, shaped by the need to remain aware. You lie still, listening. The fire murmurs faintly, embers shifting under ash. Someone coughs softly, then settles. Outside, the wind moves along the walls, testing them again. You are warm enough, not comfortable, but safe. That distinction matters here. Comfort is a luxury. Safety is the goal. People in the Middle Ages expected to wake during the night. It was normal. The idea of sleeping straight through until morning would have sounded strange. Winter nights were long, and the body did not surrender to them all at once. You drift, wake, adjust a blanket, listen, then drift again. This pattern appears repeatedly in diaries and medical writings of the time, described as first sleep and second sleep, with a quiet waking period in between. During these waking moments, you do not turn on lights. Light costs fuel. Instead, you orient yourself by sound and memory. You check the fire with a glance. You sense the warmth of the bodies beside you. Everything seems as it should be. This brief awareness is reassuring, not stressful. It keeps danger at bay. There is a belief recorded in some winter sermons that deep, uninterrupted sleep in extreme cold was risky. Oversleeping meant neglecting the fire or failing to notice a drop in temperature. Waking briefly was seen as protective. Whether this belief was rooted in observation or caution is unclear, but it shaped expectations. You notice how sleep positions matter. People curl inward, protecting vital organs. Knees draw up, arms cross the chest. Blankets are wrapped tightly, not draped loosely. Even sleeping is deliberate in winter. The body tucks itself away from exposure. Children are watched carefully. Their sleep is lighter, more restless. Adults shift around them, unconsciously forming barriers. This constant adjustment keeps warmth centered where it is needed most. It is quiet teamwork, practiced nightly. There is an odd detail mentioned in some medical texts. People were advised to warm their feet before sleep. even if the rest of the body felt warm enough. Cold feet were believed to disturb sleep and drain heat upward. Warming stones or wrapped embers were sometimes placed near the foot of the bed. The practice required care, but it was common. Dreams, it was said, changed in winter, darker, slower, heavier. Some believed cold thickened the mind, making dreams more vivid or troubling. Night prayers and charms were used to calm sleep. Whether they worked or not, the ritual itself offered comfort. You feel time stretch. Without clocks, night is measured by sensations rather than minutes. The cold outside deepens. Inside, warmth ebbs slightly as embers cool. You wake again, half aware, and someone nearby shifts a blanket closer. No words are exchanged. None are needed. There is still disagreement among modern historians about how restful this kind of sleep was. Some suggest it left people chronically tired. Others argue it matched natural circadian rhythms better than modern habits. The sources support both views, and experience likely varied. What is certain is that this sleep kept people alive. Eventually, your awareness softens. The pauses between waking grow longer. The cold fades to the background, no longer urgent. The house holds steady. Bodies breathe in slow unison. Sleep does not conquer winter. It coexists with it. You learn to rest lightly, aware enough to respond, relaxed enough to recover. In this balance, night passes, and in a world where dawn feels very far away, that is more than enough. Morning does not arrive with brightness. It arrives with a subtle shift, a thinning of darkness, a sense that the night has finally loosened its grip. You wake slowly, muscles stiff, breath visible in the dim air. Before you even think of food or work, you notice something else: the animals. In winter, animals are not separate from human survival. They are woven into it. You hear them before you see them. A low shuffle, a soft snort, the sound of hooves adjusting in straw. Livestock are close, sometimes closer than comfort would suggest, not out of sentiment, but necessity. In many medieval households, animals shared walls with people, sometimes floors, sometimes only a thin partition away. Cows, goats, sheep, even chickens were brought indoors or into attached spaces during winter. Their body heat mattered. A single cow could raise the temperature of an enclosed area noticeably. This was not speculation. It was observed, relied upon, and planned for. You smell them too. Warm hay, damp hide, manure. It is not pleasant, but it is familiar. Cleanliness in winter meant something different. Disease was feared, but cold was feared more. Keeping animals close protected them from freezing and protected people from the worst of the chill. Survival outweighed discomfort. Archaeological evidence from rural homes shows animal stalls built directly against living spaces, sometimes sharing a common wall designed to transfer warmth. In colder regions, this arrangement was nearly universal. Where animals stayed outside, mortality rates rose sharply in harsh winters, both for livestock and people. There is a lesser-known detail tucked into estate records. Animals were sometimes rearranged seasonally based on size and heat output. Larger animals were placed closer to sleeping areas. Smaller ones were grouped together to preserve warmth. This required planning and cooperation. Animals were assets, and winter management reflected that. You notice how carefully animals are bedded. Straw is layered thickly, replaced often. Dry bedding keeps animals warmer and healthier, which in turn preserves their heat contribution. Everything connects. Neglect one part, and the system weakens. Animals also provided rhythm. Their needs structured winter days, feeding times, cleaning, checking hooves and hides. These routines forced movement during daylight hours, keeping bodies active and circulation going. Winter laziness was dangerous. Animals prevented it. There is discussion among historians about how much this proximity increased disease transmission. Some argue it worsened conditions. Others point out that separation was often impossible, and that warmth reduced cold-related illnesses. The evidence remains mixed, and outcomes varied by region and hygiene practices. You feel a strange comfort in their presence. Animals breathe steadily. Their warmth is constant. Unlike fire, they do not go out unexpectedly. Unlike people, they do not worry. This steadiness calms the space. Children are often tasked with animal care in winter, under supervision. It teaches responsibility and keeps them moving. A child who checks animals learns quickly how cold affects living bodies. These lessons were not abstract. They were felt. As the day begins, you layer up again and move among them, adjusting straw, checking water that may have frozen overnight. Every small task contributes to survival. The animals depend on you. You depend on them. The cold still rules the outside world. Inside, life clusters together, human and animal, sharing warmth without ceremony. This quiet alliance, forged by winter, carries you forward into the day. One breath, one step, one steady heartbeat at a time. You reach for what is closest, not because it is special, but because it works. Winter survival in the Middle Ages relied heavily on ordinary objects pressed into unfamiliar roles. Tools were rarely single-purpose. In cold months, almost everything became part of the effort to endure. You notice the humble chest again. It stores clothing, yes, but it also blocks drafts, anchors blankets, and serves as a seat close to the hearth. When filled, it holds heat better than an empty one. People knew this. They kept chests packed in winter, even with items not immediately needed, simply to add mass and insulation. Empty space was the enemy. Wooden spoons and bowls matter more than you expect. Metal steals heat from the hands and lips. Wood feels warmer, even when it is not. This small difference reduces discomfort and encourages eating and drinking slowly. In winter, comfort supports patience, and patience supports survival. You pick up a simple clay jug. It once held water, now ale, now warmed broth. Clay retains heat longer than thin metal. Jugs were sometimes wrapped in cloth to extend this effect. The practice appears in inventories where fabric coverings are listed alongside vessels. These are not decorative. They are practical extensions of warmth. Knives, axes, and spades lean near the door. They are used daily, even in winter. Paths must be cleared, ice must be broken, firewood must be cut and split. Tools are kept indoors when possible, so metal does not become dangerously cold. Cold tools numb fingers quickly, leading to accidents. This was understood from experience, not manuals. There is an odd winter habit recorded in some regions. People warmed tools briefly before use, holding them near the hearth. This reduced shock to the hands and improved grip. It also reduced the chance of metal cracking in extreme cold. Small rituals like this protected both body and equipment. Textiles appear everywhere, not just clothing and bedding, but wall hangings, table coverings, and curtains. Fabric softens sound and traps heat. Even rough woven cloth makes a difference. Households with more textiles stayed warmer, a fact reflected in survival rates during harsh winters. You notice baskets filled with dried herbs, rags, and scraps. These are not clutter, they are resources. Rags become insulation, herbs, scent bedding, and floors believed to resist dampness. Scraps stuff shoes, line gloves, seal cracks. Nothing is truly useless in winter. There is disagreement among researchers about how consciously people thought in these terms. Some suggest it was instinctive, passed down without explanation. Others argue people clearly understood cause and effect through observation. The truth likely lies in lived knowledge, reinforced every cold season. You also see simple measuring tools, not rulers or scales, but marks on walls showing wood levels, lines on barrels showing grain reserves. These visual reminders guide behavior. When the mark drops too low, rationing begins. Tools shape discipline. As you move through the house, touching, lifting, adjusting, you realize how familiar everything feels. Winter survival did not rely on rare inventions. It relied on knowing your environment intimately, knowing which object could do more than one job, knowing when to move it, warm it, share it. The cold waits outside, unchanged. Inside, small choices accumulate. A chest placed here, a cloth hung there, a tool warmed before use, each action barely noticeable on its own. Together, they form a quiet system that keeps life moving forward. You set the object back where it belongs and step closer to the hearth. The day is still cold, winter is still long, but the tools around you are ready, shaped by generations who learned that survival often depends on the simplest things, used with care. You begin to notice something subtle, something that has been present all along but never announced itself. It is not a tool you can hold or a habit you can point to easily. It is a pattern, a way of arranging life in winter that feels almost invisible because it works so quietly. This is the method that rarely makes it into history books, not because it was rare, but because it was ordinary. The forgotten method is enclosure, not isolation, but deliberate closeness. You realize that everything you have experienced so far points toward this single idea. People, animals, objects, heat, food, and time are all drawn inward during winter. Life contracts intentionally. Space shrinks. Movement slows. Nothing spreads out unless it absolutely has to. You feel it in how rooms are used. Large spaces are abandoned. Smaller ones become crowded. Winter living happens in the tightest areas of the house. This reduces the volume of air that needs to be warmed. It also concentrates activity, making every source of heat more effective. Fires burn smaller. Bodies sit closer. Even conversations stay within a narrow range. This method shows up clearly in winter household accounts. Rooms listed in summer disappear from winter descriptions. People slept, ate, worked, and rested in the same enclosed area for months. The rest of the house existed, but it was treated as storage or buffer space. Heating everything would have been impossible. You notice how daily routines reinforce this enclosure. Tasks are brought inward. Tools are stored nearby. Food preparation happens close to the hearth. Winter discourages unnecessary movement. Every step away from warmth must justify itself. Over time, this becomes habit rather than effort. There is a small but revealing note in some manor records. Servants were instructed to gather in specific rooms during winter evenings, not just for supervision, but for warmth. Authority and efficiency overlapped. Enclosure benefited everyone, regardless of status. You also see enclosure in clothing, in bedding, in how walls are sealed and windows covered. Each layer reduces exposure. Each barrier slows loss. This is not about sealing out the world entirely. It is about managing exchange. Heat leaves slowly. Cold enters slowly. Balance is maintained. Some modern scholars suggest this method worked because it respected limits. Medieval people did not try to overpower winter. They adapted to it by shrinking their footprint. Others argue it was simply forced by scarcity. Both views may be true. Intention and necessity often align. You feel how enclosure affects the mind as well as the body. Focus narrows. Days become repetitive. The outside world feels distant. This can be comforting or stifling, depending on temperament. Winter stories and rituals helped ease this psychological pressure, giving shape to long weeks that might otherwise blur together. There is an odd detail from winter sermons and moral texts. Enclosure was sometimes praised as spiritually beneficial. Turning inward was seen as a time for reflection. Whether this belief emerged from necessity or theology is unclear, but it gave meaning to restriction. As you sit near the hearth, surrounded by people and objects, you realize how effective this method is, precisely because it lacks drama. There is no single moment where survival feels heroic. It is a steady accumulation of small decisions, reinforced daily. You look around and see the system holding. Heat lingers. Bodies stay functional. Food lasts. Tools are ready. The cold remains outside, pressing, waiting, but slowed by layers of enclosure that work together. This method did not disappear because it failed. It faded because new technologies made it less visible. Heating systems expanded living space again. Privacy returned. Rooms separated. The quiet wisdom of enclosure became background noise. Here, in this moment, you feel it clearly. Winter survival is not about fighting the season. It is about agreeing to live smaller for a while, trusting that contraction will eventually allow expansion again. The method is simple. That is why it was forgotten, and that is why it worked. You begin to see how the method actually plays out, not as an idea, but as a daily rhythm. Enclosure is not something decided once and forgotten. It is practiced from morning to night, reinforced by habit, corrected when it slips. Winter survival lives in repetition. You wake and immediately adjust the space around you. Blankets are shaken and folded close to the hearth, not carried away. Beds are not aired widely as they might be in summer. Cold air is kept out on purpose. Moisture matters, but warmth matters more. Bedding stays compact, holding on to what heat remains. Morning tasks are chosen carefully. Anything that can be done inside is done inside. Repairing tools, mending clothes, preparing food, teaching children. Even tasks that might normally happen outdoors are postponed unless necessary. When someone does step outside, it is deliberate and brief. You notice how people prepare before opening the door, checking layers, planning the task mentally so no movement is wasted. Cooking becomes the center of the day, not just for nourishment, but for heat. Pots simmer for hours, releasing warmth slowly. Lids stay on to conserve energy. You feel how the room grows slightly warmer as the day progresses, not because the fire grows larger, but because activity concentrates in one place. You also see how enclosure changes social behavior. Arguments fade faster. There is nowhere to storm off to. Tension has to soften, or it becomes unbearable. Winter forces negotiation. People learn each other's rhythms intimately. Who wakes early? Who needs more food? Who feels the cold most deeply? Children are kept close and busy. Idle children wander, burn energy, and find trouble. Winter games are quiet. Storytelling, simple crafts, learning songs. Education continues, but gently. The goal is preservation, not progress. You notice that time itself feels enclosed. Days blur together. Without fields to tend, progress is measured differently, by how much wood remains, by how the animals fare, by how everyone feels at night. Success is quiet and cumulative. There is a detail in some household rules that feels revealing. Doors between rooms were sometimes kept shut for weeks at a time in winter, even if it meant inconvenience. Opening them disrupted the thermal balance. People adapted their movement rather than their environment. Some modern historians believe this lifestyle demanded more discipline than we often credit. Others argue it was simply the only option available. Either way, it required awareness. Forgetting to close a door, letting a fire burn too high, spreading activity too widely could undo days of careful management. You feel how this method depends on cooperation. One careless person affects everyone. This is why winter behavior was taught early and enforced gently but firmly. Children learned by watching. Newcomers learned by correction. As evening approaches, the space tightens again. Lamps are lit sparingly. Everyone gathers into the smallest usable area. The outside world fades. Enclosure deepens. You settle in, feeling the rhythm carry you. Nothing dramatic has happened today, and that is the point. The method works because it turns survival into routine. Winter is endured not by resisting it, but by shaping life to fit inside it. You begin to notice that winter does not look the same everywhere. The method stays familiar, but its shape shifts as you travel. Enclosure adapts to landscape, climate, and tradition. What works in one place would feel wrong in another. Medieval people understood this without maps or theories. They learned by living where they were. You imagine moving north, where winters are longer and colder. Houses here crouch even lower. Roofs are steep, shedding snow quickly. Walls grow thicker. Windows shrink further. In some regions, homes are partially sunk into the ground, using earth itself as insulation. This technique appears repeatedly in colder climates, and archaeological remains confirm how effective it was. The ground holds a steady temperature when air does not. In these areas, winter living spaces become almost cave-like. Light is sacrificed willingly. People accept dimness in exchange for warmth. Lamps are few. Fire is constant but restrained. The method of enclosure feels more intense here, more absolute. Life pulls inward early and stays there longer. You travel south and feel the shift. Winters are shorter, damp rather than deeply cold. Houses open slightly more. Ventilation matters, because moisture brings its own dangers. Here, enclosure focuses on dryness as much as heat. Fires are smaller. Smoke escapes more readily. Clothing layers adjust, favoring breathability. In coastal regions, salt air changes everything. Wood rots faster. Fires behave differently. People rely more on textiles and shared heat than heavy construction. Fishing communities bring nets indoors in winter, not just to repair them, but to keep them from freezing stiff. Workspaces shrink to maintain warmth. Mountain regions add another layer. Snow isolates villages for weeks. Enclosure becomes communal. Shared halls appear more often, bringing multiple households together. This reduces fuel use and concentrates heat sources. Social boundaries soften under necessity. Disputes are postponed. Cooperation becomes survival. There is a lesser-known winter adaptation in some alpine areas. People timed major tasks to weather patterns, not calendars. When snow softened briefly, everyone moved at once. When cold returned, everyone retreated together. Enclosure expanded and contracted with the climate itself. You notice how animals factor differently by region. In colder zones, animals move closer indoors. In milder ones, They remain outside but clustered tightly with wind barriers. The principle stays the same. Heat is gathered, exposure is reduced. Food storage adapts as well. In the north, freezing preserves food naturally. In the south, salting and drying dominate. Root cellars vary in depth and design, but everywhere, winter food stays close, protected, and rationed carefully. There is debate among historians about whether these regional differences developed independently or spread through cultural exchange. Trade routes existed even in winter. Ideas traveled with people, yet local conditions clearly shaped outcomes. Adaptation was both shared and specific. You feel how the method of enclosure is not rigid. It bends. It responds. Medieval people were not trapped by tradition. They adjusted constantly. If something failed, it changed. Survival demanded flexibility. As you imagine settling in one place for the season, you sense how quickly habits would form. Within days, you would know which corner stays warmest, which wall leaks cold, which time of day feels safest to move. This knowledge anchors you. Winter becomes manageable, even predictable. The cold remains powerful everywhere, but it is never met the same way twice. Enclosure becomes a local language, spoken differently in each region, but always understood. You pause, feeling the weight of this quiet intelligence. Not written, not centralized, but lived, passed through hands and houses and winters. The method survives because it listens to place. And as you settle again near the hearth of wherever you are, you realize that medieval winter survival was never one solution. It was many, shaped by land and weather, all built on the same gentle idea. Pull inward, stay close, endure together. As winter deepens, you notice something else woven quietly into daily life. Faith, not loud or triumphant, but steady, habitual, and practical. In a season where control feels limited, belief offers structure. It gives winter a shape beyond cold and darkness. You hear prayers spoken softly near the hearth, often at the same times each day. Morning, evening, before sleep. These moments anchor time when daylight fails to do so. Bells, where they exist, cut through the cold air, marking hours that would otherwise blur together. Even people who rarely attended church in warmer months leaned more heavily on ritual in winter. The season invited reflection, willingly or not. Winter services were different, shorter, simpler, candles burned lower. Sermons often focused on endurance, patience, and humility. Surviving winter was framed as both physical and spiritual labor. Hardship carried meaning. Endurance became virtue. You notice small objects placed carefully around the living space. A carved symbol near the door, a simple cross above the bed. These are not decorative, they are protective, at least in belief. Cold, illness, and misfortune blurred together in medieval thinking. Prayer guarded against all three. There is a small detail recorded in parish records that feels telling. Attendance often increased during the coldest months. Even when travel was difficult, people risked the cold for reassurance. Being together in sacred space echoed the enclosure of home life. Shared warmth, shared belief. You also see how faith shaped behavior. Excess was discouraged in winter. Fasting rules shifted slightly, acknowledging physical need, but restraint remained valued. Winter was seen as a time to conserve, not indulge. This aligned neatly with survival needs. Some people believed winter illness reflected moral imbalance. Others saw it as a test. Either way, prayer offered comfort when medicine failed. Medieval remedies were limited. Faith filled the gaps. There is still disagreement among historians about how much belief influenced survival outcomes. Some argue it provided psychological resilience. Others suggest its impact was mostly emotional. What is clear is that faith shaped how people understood winter, making endurance feel purposeful rather than random. As night falls, you join the quiet murmur of voices. The cold presses in. The prayer ends. Nothing has changed outwardly, but inside, something steadies. You settle again near the fire, feeling belief wrap around winter like another layer. Not warm, exactly, but reassuring, enough to carry you through another long night. You begin to notice who truly keeps winter running, and it is not the figures who appear in chronicles or official records. It is the women. Their knowledge is quiet, domestic, and constant, woven into daily survival so thoroughly that it often goes unnamed. Winter, exposes this truth clearly. You watch hands move with confidence. Dough is mixed without measuring. Cloth is layered without hesitation. Fires are adjusted instinctively. These skills are not written down. They are learned early, practiced daily, and corrected gently over years. Winter does not allow for uncertainty, and this knowledge carries households through the cold. Food preparation falls largely to women, and in winter this role expands. It is not just cooking, it is rationing, knowing how much can be used now and how much must wait, knowing when to add fat, when to stretch grain, when to save meat for colder days ahead. One wrong decision echoes for weeks. Experience guides every choice. You notice how warmth is managed carefully. Blankets are redistributed at night. Children are shifted closer to heat. Clothing is dried near the fire, but never too close. Damp fabric is dangerous. These adjustments happen almost invisibly, often while others sleep. There is a lesser-known detail found in household accounts. Women often controlled keys to storage chests during winter. This was not about authority alone. It was about responsibility. Managing supplies required trust and attention. Winter survival depended on careful hands. You also see women at work mending endlessly. Gloves, socks, tunics, bedding. Repairs are prioritized over new work. A patched garment that blocks wind is worth more than an unworn one that does not fit the season. Needles flash in firelight, steady and patient. Childcare becomes more complex in winter. Illness spreads easily. Appetite fades. Sleep is restless. Women monitor subtle changes, responding before problems grow. This vigilance saves lives quietly, without record. There is discussion among modern historians about how much agency women held within these systems. Some argue winter increased their influence within the household. Others caution against overstating power. What is clear is that winter relied heavily on their expertise, regardless of formal status. You feel how this knowledge binds generations. Girls learn by watching. Correction is gentle but firm. By adulthood, winter habits feel automatic. There is no drama in this learning, only repetition. As night approaches, you see women guiding Enclosure again. Doors closed, lamps lowered, food set aside. The house tightens its circle. Everyone benefits from this care, even if few acknowledge it. You settle near the hearth and realize that winter survival is not heroic. It is domestic. It lives in kitchens, sleeping spaces, storage rooms. It depends on attention, memory, and calm decision-making. And it is carried, year after year, by women whose work rarely enters history books, but without whom winter would have won far more often. You begin to see winter through smaller eyes. Children experience the cold differently, not just because their bodies are smaller, but because their understanding is still forming. Winter teaches them early, whether anyone intends it to or not. You watch how they are guided, corrected, protected, and quietly trained to endure. Children are kept close in winter, physically and socially. Wandering is discouraged. Play moves indoors. Games become quieter, slower, more contained. Loud running wastes energy. Sweating invites chill. Adults do not always explain this. Children learn by being stopped, redirected, wrapped in extra layers without discussion. You notice how clothing changes for them first. Sleeves lengthen, socks double, hoods stay up. Children are checked constantly for cold hands and feet. A child who goes numb cannot always articulate it. Adults rely on touch, habit, and observation. Food is adjusted carefully. Children eat more often, even if portions are small. Warm foods are prioritized. Broth before sleep, bread soaked in liquid, sweetened porridge when supplies allow. Appetite becomes a signal. A child who stops eating draws immediate concern. Winter illnesses cluster around the young. Coughs linger. Fevers rise quickly. Medieval medicine offers limited tools, so prevention becomes everything. Warmth, rest, and watchfulness dominate care. Children are kept between adults at night, protected by shared heat. Sleep becomes a communal responsibility. There is a small detail noted in some household writings. Children were sometimes given extra bedding before elders, not because elders were less valued, but because children were seen as more vulnerable to cold. Survival of the young meant survival of the household's future. You also notice how children contribute. They gather kindling, tend animals under supervision, help with mending. Winter gives them purpose without overexertion. Feeling useful matters. It steadies the mind during long, dark weeks. Education shifts too. Lessons happen by the hearth. Stories replace outdoor instruction. Memory is trained through repetition. Winter becomes a season of listening. Songs are learned. Tales are retold. History, morality, and practical advice blend together. Learning warms the space without burning fuel. There is discussion among historians about whether medieval childhood was harsher than we imagine. Some argue children were pushed too hard. Others note the care and adaptation evident in winter routines. What emerges clearly is attentiveness. Winter sharpened awareness of fragility. You watch a child fall asleep mid-story, head leaning against an adult's arm. No one moves them immediately. Shifting risks, losing warmth. Sleep is allowed to come naturally. Blankets are adjusted around them. This patience is learned. Winter teaches children boundaries. Where they can go, when they must stop, how to listen to their bodies. These lessons stay with them. By adulthood, winter habits feel instinctive. As the fire burns low, you feel how much effort goes into keeping the smallest warm, fed, and calm. It is quiet labor, rarely recorded, yet it carries the season forward. You settle again, aware that winter survival is not only about those who endure it now, but about those being taught how to endure it next time. Children absorb the method without ever naming it, and one day they will pass it on the same way. Not every winter ends quietly. You feel that truth settle in as you listen to older voices lower, memories surfacing that do not get told lightly. Some winters overwhelm even the best preparation. The method bends, strains, and sometimes breaks. You sense it first in food stores running thin. Barrels feel lighter, bread grows smaller, meals lose fat and thickness. People notice but do not panic immediately. Winter always tightens toward the end. Hope rests on endurance. But some years, the cold lasts longer than expected. Snow lingers. Thaws never come. Illness follows weakness. Coughs deepen. Wounds heal slowly. A simple chill turns into something heavier. Medieval people recognized this pattern. They spoke of winters that drained strength day by day rather than striking suddenly. These were the dangerous ones. You notice how routines begin to fray. Enclosure still holds, but fatigue creeps in. Fires burn a little too low. Repairs are postponed. People move less carefully. Winter does not need catastrophe. It needs accumulation. There are years recorded in chronicles where entire villages struggled. Not wiped out, but diminished. Fewer births. More funerals in early spring. These accounts are often brief, almost reluctant. Scribes wrote numbers, not stories, but the silence speaks. You hear of animals failing first. Livestock weaken when fodder runs low. Losing an animal means losing heat, food, and labor all at once. This loss ripples through the household. People adjust quickly, but the gap remains. There is a small detail found in some winter records. When survival felt uncertain, communities gathered more often, not less. Shared meals, shared prayers, shared work. Even scarcity was faced together. Isolation in hard winters proved deadly. Modern historians do not agree on how often winter collapse occurred. Some suggest these moments were rare exceptions. Others argue they were more common than surviving records suggest. What remains clear is that people remembered them deeply. You feel the emotional weight of such winters. Fear sharpens. Sleep grows lighter. The cold feels louder. Yet even here, the method does not disappear. It compresses further. People move closer. Fires are watched constantly. Hope narrows to small victories. Eventually, winter loosens its grip. Even the hardest season ends, but it leaves marks. Fewer voices, empty places, knowledge reinforced through loss. You sit quietly with that understanding. Medieval winter survival was effective, but never guaranteed. The method reduced risk. It did not erase it, and that awareness shaped how people respected the cold. The fire glows softly. Outside, snow still lies thick. Inside, endurance continues, tempered now by memory. Winter can be survived, but it is never harmless. You sense a different kind of conversation unfolding now, one that stretches far beyond the hearth and into centuries of quiet study. Long after these winters passed, people began to argue about them, not around fires, but around tables piled with notes, fragments, and half-preserved records. The question lingers, how much did this method truly matter? Some researchers believe the enclosure way of living was the backbone of winter survival. They point to settlement patterns, house designs, and seasonal records that show fewer deaths where people lived smaller in winter. These patterns appear again and again, across regions that never directly contacted each other. That repetition suggests something deliberate, learned, and effective. Others are more cautious. They argue that survival depended less on method and more on luck, weather fluctuations, harvest success, disease cycles. From this view, enclosure looks less like strategy and more like necessity dressed up after the fact. People did what they could, and sometimes it worked. You feel how both views hold truth. The records are incomplete. Most medieval people left no personal accounts. What survives comes from institutions, elites, and moments of crisis. Ordinary winters rarely merited writing. This silence complicates certainty. Archaeological evidence adds another layer. Excavated homes show wear patterns that shift seasonally. Certain rooms show more use in winter. Hearths move closer to sleeping areas over generations. These physical traces suggest intentional adaptation. Still, interpretation remains cautious. Stone does not explain itself. There is also disagreement about comfort. Some scholars suggest medieval people tolerated cold far better than modern bodies. Others argue constant exposure weakened them over time. Measurements are impossible. Experience varies. What remains visible is behavior. People changed how they lived when winter arrived. You notice how modern debates mirror medieval ones in spirit. How much control do humans truly have over environment? How much is adaptation? How much is chance? Winter becomes a lens through which larger questions surface. A curious fringe idea appears occasionally. Some propose that enclosure influenced social development long-term, shaping communal values and cooperation. Living close for months demanded negotiation and empathy. Whether this carried into other seasons remains uncertain, but the possibility lingers. As you listen to these distant arguments, you remain grounded in the quiet space around you. The fire does not care about theory. The walls do not respond to debate. They simply hold warmth or lose it. You realize that certainty was never required for survival. Medieval people did not need to know why something worked. They only needed to know that it did. Enclosure persisted because it helped, not because it was proven. The discussion continues long after the last winter you imagine here. But in this moment, near the hearth, the method speaks for itself. Debate fades. Warmth remains. You start to hear about the stranger attempts people made to keep winter at bay. Not the careful habits that worked quietly, but the odd remedies, the hopeful experiments, the things tried when fear crept in late at night and the cold felt personal. Winter encouraged creativity, even when logic wavered. You listen as someone recalls rubbing the chest with warm oil mixed with crushed herbs, convinced it sealed heat inside the body. Another swears by hanging dried animal skins on the walls, believing they trapped warmth in the room itself. These practices were not mocked at the time. When survival feels uncertain, anything that offers comfort earns respect. Some remedies were inherited from much older traditions. Burning specific woods was thought to protect against illness as well as cold. Juniper, for example, appears often in winter accounts. Its sharp scent filled rooms and was believed to purify the air. Whether it changed temperature or not, it changed mood. Sharp smells cut through winter stagnation. You hear about stones placed under pillows to ward off chills in the head, salt tucked into clothing, small charms sewn into linings. These gestures did not replace enclosure or shared heat, but they layered onto it. Winter survival was never purely practical, it was emotional as well. Medical advice of the time blurred easily with belief. Physicians recommended warming the body from the inside with certain foods and drinks, but they also warned against cold thoughts and melancholy. The mind, they believed, could invite illness. Cheerfulness became another kind of insulation. There is a curious note in some winter writings about laughter. Being cheerful was thought to generate warmth. People were encouraged to tell jokes, sing softly, and avoid despair. This might sound quaint, but modern understanding of stress suggests there was something to it. Calm bodies conserve energy better than tense ones. You hear of people sleeping with heated bricks wrapped in cloth, carefully placed to avoid burns. Others warmed metal coins and carried them in pockets as talismans and hand warmers. The line between superstition and observation blurs. Some of these practices worked slightly, others worked only in the mind. Both mattered. One odd belief held that certain colours repelled cold. Red thread appears often in winter garments, sewn into seams or worn around wrists. It symbolised warmth, blood, life. Whether the colour mattered physically is doubtful, but it reminded people of warmth when they needed it most. You notice how these remedies increased during especially harsh winters. When standard methods felt insufficient, people reached for anything that promised relief. This did not mean they abandoned enclosure. It meant they layered hope on top of habit. There is disagreement among modern historians about how widespread these practices were. Some argue they were fringe, limited to moments of panic. Others suggest they were quietly common, rarely recorded because they were informal. The truth likely varies by region and household. What strikes you is how rarely these remedies replaced cooperation. People still gathered. They still shared heat. Charms were individual. Survival remained collective. You imagine sitting near the hearth as someone quietly presses a warm stone into your hands, saying nothing, just offering comfort. The gesture matters more than the object. Winter strips life down to essentials, and kindness becomes one of them. As the night deepens, these small rituals fade into the background hum of survival. They do not dominate winter life, but they colour it. They remind you that medieval people were not cold machines following rigid rules. They were anxious, hopeful, imaginative humans trying to feel safe. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. Inside, warmth is built from habit, belief, and shared presence. Even the strangest remedies tell the same story. Winter was endured not just with walls and wool, but with meaning. You settle back, feeling how fear and creativity coexist. The method holds, the charms whisper, and the night passes, one hopeful habit at a time. You begin to feel the difference that wealth makes, and just as quickly, you realize how limited that difference is once winter settles in. Cold does not respect titles. It moves through stone halls and thatched huts alike, testing everyone with the same patience. Money changes how you respond, not whether you must respond at all. In wealthier households, space is larger, and at first glance that seems like an advantage. More rooms, higher ceilings, grand halls. But winter turns excess space into a liability. Heating large areas wastes fuel. Even lords retreat from their own halls, abandoning impressive rooms in favour of smaller chambers tucked deep within the structure. Servants close off wings. Curtains are drawn across doorways. Enclosure asserts itself again, regardless of status. You notice that wealthy homes rely heavily on textiles in winter. Thick tapestries line walls, not just for decoration, but for insulation. Floors are layered with rugs. Beds are surrounded by heavy curtains, sometimes multiple layers deep. These fabrics trap warmth and soften drafts. Estate records show that winter textiles were valuable assets, moved carefully between rooms as needed. Fireplaces multiply in rich households, but fuel still matters. Wood must be cut, hauled, stored. Even wealth cannot conjure endless supply. In some regions, lords restricted firewood use during harsh winters, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Overuse early in the season could mean disaster later. You also see that servants feel winter differently. They move more. They work in colder spaces. Their clothing is simpler, yet they benefit from the same enclosure method. Sleeping quarters are crowded. Shared warmth protects them too. Wealth does not eliminate dependence. It redistributes it. In poorer households, space is already limited. Enclosure happens naturally. Fewer rooms mean less air to heat. Families cluster instinctively. Their disadvantage lies in thinner margins. Less food, less fuel, less ability to absorb mistakes. Winter punishes error more harshly here. You feel how class shapes anxiety. The wealthy worry about managing abundance. The poor worry about running out. Both worry. Winter equalizes fear, if not comfort. There is a lesser-known detail from legal records. During extreme winters, some communities temporarily relaxed class boundaries. Shared halls opened. Communal fires burned. These measures were not charity alone. They prevented unrest and reduced mortality. Cold did not care who froze, but consequences followed. Modern historians differ on how much class determined winter survival. Some argue wealth significantly improved outcomes. Others note that isolation in large, poorly enclosed homes could be deadly. Survival depended more on behavior than ownership. You sense that the forgotten method bridged class divides. Enclosure, shared heat, reduced movement. These strategies worked everywhere. Those who ignored them suffered, regardless of rank. As night settles again, you find yourself in a smaller room, even in a large house. Curtains drawn, fire low, people gathered, status fades in the dim light. Winter insists on humility. You breathe slowly, feeling warmth hold steady. Cold presses from outside. Inside, the method continues, indifferent to wealth, loyal only to those who respect its quiet rules. Night settles fully now, and you notice how sound changes in winter. It does not disappear. It sharpens, then softens, then stretches. The cold carries noise differently, and the enclosed space of the house reshapes it again. You sit still and listen, because listening becomes part of staying safe. The first thing you hear is the house itself. Wood contracts as temperatures drop. Beams give quiet pops and long creaks. Not signs of failure, but of adjustment. Medieval people recognized these sounds well. A house that stayed silent in deep cold could be more worrying than one that spoke. Sound meant the structure was responding, not cracking. Outside, the world feels muffled. Snow absorbs noise. Wind moves differently when the air is dense and cold. Footsteps vanish quickly. This quiet can be unsettling. Without sound, distance becomes harder to judge. Medieval night watchmen relied heavily on listening, not sight. Sound carried warnings long before danger arrived. Inside, voices drop naturally. No one announces this change. It simply happens. Loud speech wastes energy and stirs air. Winter conversations become slower, softer, more deliberate. Even laughter changes. It stays close to the body, less explosive, more controlled. You notice the rhythm of breathing around you. Multiple people sleeping or resting in the same space create a gentle pattern, almost like waves. This sound is reassuring. Silence, complete silence, invites worry. Someone always coughs. Someone shifts. These small noises confirm life continues. Animals add their own layer. A cow shifts weight. Straw rustles. A goat lets out a low sound in sleep. These noises are steady, predictable. They anchor the night. Medieval people learned to recognize what belonged and what did not. An unfamiliar sound in winter carried weight. There is a small detail mentioned in some winter accounts. People could identify weather changes by sound alone. Snow falling is almost silent. Ice cracking is sharp and sudden. Wind before a storm has a different tone than wind on a clear night. Listening was a skill. You also hear the fire, not the crackle of large flames, but the subtle movement of embers. A sigh as ash settles, a faint hiss if moisture escapes. This sound tells you whether warmth will last until morning. Experienced ears knew when the fire needed attention, without opening eyes fully. There is disagreement among modern scholars about how aware medieval people were of their acoustic environment. Some argue they were simply accustomed to it. Others suggest they actively trained attention. In a world without constant background noise, listening mattered more. You feel how sound supports enclosure. Walls not only hold heat, they shape noise. Thick walls soften the outside world. Fabric absorbs echoes. A winter room feels hushed but not empty. This balance calms the nervous system, even if no one names it that way. Night watch duties rotate in some households and communities. Someone stays half awake, listening more than watching. This role shifts through the night. It is not formal everywhere, but the function exists. Awareness is shared, just like warmth. You imagine lying still, eyes closed, recognizing each sound. That creak is normal. That breath belongs to someone near. That animal has settled. Nothing requires action. The ability to decide this without moving saves energy and preserves warmth. Winter nights are long. Listening fills the time between sleep cycles. It prevents the mind from wandering too far into fear. Sound grounds you in the present moment. As the hours pass, the quiet deepens again. Snow continues to fall. The house continues to respond. Inside, the enclosed world hums softly with life. You rest into that soundscape, letting it hold you. Winter does not need to be silent to be endured. It needs to be familiar. And as the night carries on, the sounds around you whisper the same message over and over. You are still here. The warmth is holding. The night is passing. You wake to a change so subtle it almost slips past you. The darkness is still there, but it feels thinner, less heavy. The air holds a faint promise. Spring does not arrive suddenly in the medieval world. It announces itself slowly, through small mercies that you learn to notice because you have learned to watch everything. The first sign is light, not warmth, just light. Dawn comes a little earlier, or dusk lingers a moment longer. Candles last an extra evening. Lamps are trimmed later than usual. People comment on it quietly, as if speaking too loudly might scare it away. Light is hope you can see. You feel it in the cold as well. The air still bites, but it no longer gnaws. The cold feels tired. Frost still forms, but it retreats sooner in the day. Snow softens at the edges. Paths turn slick instead of solid. These changes are dangerous and welcome at the same time. Daily routines shift cautiously. No one abandons Enclosure yet. That would be foolish. But movement increases slightly. Doors open a little longer. Work spills just beyond the threshold when weather allows. Winter loosens its grip one finger at a time. You notice how food changes. Stores are still guarded, but portions grow a touch more generous. Preserved foods are used more freely, making room for what might come next. People begin to talk about planting, not with certainty, but with longing. Seeds are checked and rechecked. Tools are inspected. Plans form quietly. Animals respond before people do. They grow restless. Milk changes. Births begin among livestock. These signs matter deeply. They signal renewal, not just emotionally, but practically. Fresh milk, new animals, future labor. Survival expands again. You hear laughter change. It becomes lighter, less restrained. Stories shift from endurance to anticipation. Winter tales give way to plans. The house feels less tight. Though no one moves furniture yet, Enclosure remains, but its purpose evolves. It is no longer a shield. It becomes a base. There is discussion among historians about how medieval people perceived seasonal change. Some argue they experienced it more intensely than we do. Others suggest familiarity dulled surprise. What seems clear is that spring mattered profoundly. It meant survival had worked. You also notice caution. Thaws bring sickness. Meltwater spreads dampness. People stay alert. Fires still burn. Layers are still worn. Winter has not vanished. It has simply stepped back. There is a small detail found in some calendars and almanacs. Certain days were marked as hopeful long before warmth arrived. Feast days tied to light returning, not temperature. These moments helped people endure the final stretch. Symbolic spring arrived before physical spring. You feel the emotional weight lift slightly. The constant vigilance eases. Sleep deepens. Bodies recover. Muscles loosen. The mind wanders forward instead of inward. This shift is as important as any physical change. As days lengthen, Enclosure begins to relax. Not fully, not yet, but enough to remind you that contraction was always temporary. Living smaller made living longer possible. You step outside briefly and feel the cold sun on your face. It is weak, but it is real. You breathe deeply. Winter has not defeated you. It has been endured. You return inside, closing the door gently. The house still holds warmth. The method still holds. But now, it feels like preparation for something new, rather than defense against something endless. Spring will come, not tomorrow, not easily, but it will come, and because of the quiet work done all winter, you will be there to meet it. You begin to realize how easily this knowledge could slip away, not all at once, not through disaster, but through comfort. The method that carried people through winter did not disappear because it failed. It faded because it became unnecessary, then invisible. As winters grew slightly milder in some periods and technologies improved, people expanded again. Houses gained more rooms meant to be used year-round. Windows grew larger. Fireplaces improved. Later still, chimneys became more efficient. Then stoves. Then systems that distributed heat evenly without constant attention. Space no longer had to shrink when cold arrived. With this expansion came forgetfulness. Enclosure felt restrictive when it was no longer required. Privacy became desirable again. Sleeping alone returned as a sign of status and comfort rather than risk. Animals moved back outside permanently. Shared heat gave way to controlled heat. You can feel how quickly habits change when danger recedes. Knowledge that is no longer practiced loses its urgency. Children stop learning it. Adults stop teaching it. What was once instinct becomes odd, even uncomfortable. Written records reflect this shift subtly. Household advice from later centuries emphasizes ventilation and cleanliness more than warmth conservation. These concerns are valid in new contexts, but they signal a changed relationship with cold. Winter becomes something to defeat rather than accommodate. There is discussion among historians about whether this loss of knowledge happened evenly across society. Some argue rural communities held on to enclosure practices much longer than urban ones. Others point to class differences, where wealth insulated people from seasonal risk earlier. The picture is uneven, but the trend is clear. You notice how language changes. Winter stops being described as an adversary and becomes a season among others. Words tied to endurance fade. Words tied to comfort rise. This shift shapes memory itself. What is no longer named is rarely remembered. There is also a cultural factor. Progress narratives favor innovation over adaptation. The quiet success of Enclosure lacks drama. It does not fit stories of advancement. Technologies that conquer cold feel more impressive than habits that coexist with it. You sense a certain irony. The method was forgotten precisely because it worked. It reduced crisis to routine. It left few dramatic records. Survival without spectacle rarely earns attention. Even today, traces remain without explanation. Small rooms heated first, curtains drawn in winter, people gathering instinctively in the warmest part of a house. These behaviors echo Enclosure, though few recognize their origin. You sit with that thought. Knowledge does not always vanish. Sometimes it sinks beneath the surface, waiting. The forgotten method is not gone. It is dormant, embedded in habits, architecture, and instinct. As you reflect, the house around you feels like a memory itself. Thick walls, low light, shared warmth. This way of living carried humanity through centuries of cold without fanfare. Winter receded, memory followed, but the method remains quietly intact, ready to surface when needed. You begin to notice how familiar some of this still feels, even now, not because you have lived it exactly, but because echoes of the method linger quietly in the modern world. The past does not vanish cleanly. It leaves fingerprints. You think about how people instinctively gather in one room during cold evenings, even in houses with heat everywhere. The living room becomes the center. Doors close, lights dim, movement slows. No one announces this choice. It simply happens. Comfort draws people inward the same way winter once did. You notice how bedding grows heavier in cold months. Extra blankets appear without discussion. Sleeping positions shift closer. Pets climb into beds more often, welcomed for warmth as much as companionship. This behavior feels modern, but it is ancient. Shared heat still works. Clothing follows the same pattern. Layers return each winter. Not just coats outdoors, but socks indoors. Sweaters kept within reach. Scarves worn long after stepping inside. The body still responds to cold with the same logic. Protect openings. Trap warmth. Reduce exposure. You think about emergency advice given during power outages or extreme cold. Authorities recommend closing off unused rooms, staying in one area, sharing warmth, using blankets and body heat. These are not new ideas. They are Enclosure, reintroduced under stress. Even architecture carries the memory. Older homes often feel warmer in winter despite less advanced heating. Smaller rooms, thicker walls, lower ceilings. Newer buildings sometimes struggle more, relying entirely on systems rather than form. When systems fail, the old shapes quietly outperform. You notice how winter holidays cluster around light and gathering. Candles, fires, shared meals, long evenings indoors. These traditions survive because they serve a need beyond celebration. They stabilize the season emotionally. There is discussion among modern thinkers about resilience, how communities respond to disruption, how people cope when technology falters. Many of the answers echo medieval habits: cooperation, reduced space, shared resources, attention to basics. You see this during storms, blackouts, crises. People gather, they check on neighbors, they cook together, they stay close. The instinct surfaces quickly. The method is remembered by the body, even if the mind does not name it. You also notice resistance. Modern life values space, privacy, autonomy. Enclosure can feel uncomfortable. It asks for patience and compromise. It slows things down, but when conditions demand it, people adapt faster than they expect. There is still debate about how much modern society could relearn from these habits. Some argue technology makes them unnecessary. Others point out that resilience depends on understanding fundamentals: heat, food, shelter, proximity. You feel how the method offers something beyond survival. It offers rhythm. Winter becomes a time of inward focus rather than constant resistance. Rest becomes acceptable. Stillness gains value. As you sit with this realization, the past feels less distant. Medieval people were not strange or primitive. They responded intelligently to conditions with the tools they had. The core logic remains sound. You breathe slowly, feeling warmth gather where you are now. Perhaps you are indoors, wrapped in fabric, lights low. Perhaps others are nearby. Even alone, you are likely in a smaller, warmer space. The method hums quietly beneath your comfort. The forgotten winter survival method was never truly lost. It simply stepped aside, waiting. And in moments when the cold presses in again, it returns, familiar and steady, reminding you that endurance does not always require invention. Sometimes it requires remembering how to live a little smaller, a little closer, and a little more patiently. You settle deeper, letting that thought soften. Winter passes. Knowledge remains. You feel the winter finally loosening its hold, not with a sudden release, but with a quiet permission to relax. The method has carried you this far, and now it begins to release you in the same gentle way it held you. Nothing ends abruptly. Enclosure softens. Space expands slowly. Life breathes outward again. You notice how people begin to spread through the house, not all at once. One room opens, then another. Furniture shifts slightly. Tools return to places not used since autumn. The hearth still burns, but it no longer commands everything around it. Warmth feels less precious, though never taken for granted. Clothing layers thin gradually. A scarf comes off indoors. Gloves stay near the door instead of on hands. People still dress carefully, but the vigilance eases. Bodies trust the air again. Food changes more visibly now. Preserved stores are used with less calculation. Meals brighten in flavor. Freshness becomes a topic of conversation rather than a memory. The body responds quickly. Energy returns. Movement feels lighter. Animals move outward too. Stalls open. Doors are left ajar. Sounds change. The house feels less crowded, less dense. This expansion feels earned. It is not careless. It is measured. You realize how much patience winter demanded, and how deeply that patience shaped behavior. The method did not just keep people warm, it trained them to wait, to observe, to accept limits without despair. These skills linger beyond the season. There is something bittersweet here. The closeness that kept everyone safe begins to dissolve. Privacy returns. Solitude becomes possible again. Some miss the intimacy, others welcome the space. Both reactions are human. You think about how many winters this method carried people through, century after century, quietly, without instruction manuals, without praise. It shaped architecture, habits, relationships, and expectations. And then, once it was no longer essential, it slipped into the background. You sit with the fire one last time in this way, not because you must, but because you choose to. The warmth feels familiar, comforting, earned. The cold is no longer an enemy at the door. It is a memory fading behind you. You survive not by conquering it, but by cooperating with reality, by living smaller, by staying close, by paying attention. As you rest here, you understand why this knowledge faded. It asks for humility. It asks for patience. It asks for shared space and shared responsibility. These are not always celebrated qualities, but they are powerful ones. You breathe slowly, letting the warmth settle into you. Winter has passed. The method has done its work. And now, it lets you go. The room grows quieter. Your thoughts slow. The fire softens to a steady glow. There is nothing left to prepare for tonight, nothing left to watch closely. You have done enough. You allow your body to sink into stillness, knowing that warmth does not need your attention anymore. The walls hold. The air is calm. The season has turned. As your breathing evens out, the images fade gently. Thick walls, shared heat, quiet routines, all of it drifts back into memory, where it belongs. You are safe. You are warm. You are allowed to rest. Sleep comes easily now, not because you are exhausted, but because there is no need to stay alert, the night passes without demand. Let the quiet carry you the rest of the way. Sweet dreams.